Metaversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about judicial duels. Now, first off, what is a judicial duel? Well, I think everyone understands what a duel is: a fight between two people, sometimes to first blood, sometimes to the death. Okay, duels, we get that. What is a judicial duel? Well, a judicial duel is a duel, a fight between two combatants to resolve a legal challenge of some kind, usually an accusation of guilt against someone, or to defend one's own innocence. And in a situation where you can't definitively establish either guilt or innocence because you're in a very low-tech setting, we don't have advanced forensics to establish this, when there was no way to prove who did what, a duel could be undertaken to resolve the matter between the two conflicting parties. This, of course, obviously is by no means a perfect way to resolve anything, because people could be wrongly accused. There could be someone making the accusation who, in their mind, feels they know who the culprit is, but they could actually be wrong, and they could be challenging an innocent person to the death. But if they feel so wronged and they're pushed to that level, well, the desire for justice can actually push us into a position where we would be willing to sacrifice or risk our own lives to achieve it. But having said that, I do feel there are situations in which, say, the person wronged truly knows who the culprit is, but they can't prove it. And for that desire for justice, they're willing to risk their own lives, and they will challenge them to a duel. Now, sometimes it won't actually be a challenge. Sometimes this legal challenge might be brought to whatever judicial authority is in the local area, and the matter can't be resolved because there's no way to prove. There's no witnesses. It's just someone is saying something and someone is denying it. So what can be done? And in those instances, the judicial authority can say, well, the only way to resolve this is by a duel. Fight it out. Whoever wins is the winner, right? We need to understand the medieval judicial duel is not a light thing. This is someone risking their own lives in a fight. Most often, when it actually comes to judicial duels, they were to the death. And even if a death didn't result out of the judicial duel, if I was accusing someone of, say, a hugely grievous crime that I couldn't prove, but I knew they did it, and the only way to gain justice is through a duel to the death, and I'm willing to risk my own life to achieve it, we fight, I defeat the opponent, but I don't kill him. I incapacitate him, okay? A legal precedent was established in that duel, and that is my defeated opponent's guilt. And because they are now seen guilty officially because of the duel, which is really interesting, not proven guilt by evidence, but proven guilt through combat, that person, the defeated, will actually still be executed. And so judicial duels mostly ended in death. So with these type of duels being so significant, you can understand that they weren't treated lightly. And we also need to understand this in a better historical context, because our minds can be a bit skewed when it comes to pop culture and stuff like that, where there is a warrior who's just unbeatable. And if there was such a warrior who could just beat everyone, you could see that they would be able to exploit the judicial duels quite a bit. Now, there are actually kind of instances where it was exploited a bit, but there are ways to try and mitigate this, and you have to understand, in reality, even if you are the best warrior in the world, there is always a chance that you will be absolutely killed by a noob by simply making a mistake or them getting lucky. Every competent warrior would know that, and they would know, even if they're really talented, whoever they're fighting, there is a chance that they will die in this. Remember, oftentimes judicial duels did not allow armor, okay? Shields, yes. Weapons, yes. Not armor necessarily. More often than not, no. And so there was a very high chance that one, misstep will lead to your death completely. So even if you're a very talented warrior, there would be a certain level of hesitance to just jump into it, and I think even a level of reluctance to abuse this legal practice. And now we come to some of the ways they were conducted, because remember how I said there were certain things to try and mitigate unfair duels and stuff like that? Well, I'll get to those specifics, kind of starting at the first type of judicial duel that we have record of. And it is called the Holm game, practiced in the Scandinavian region, so we're looking at Denmark, Norway, Sweden, even in Iceland, okay, and we're looking at the early medieval period. There's actually no record of lawfully sanctioned duels in Anglo-Saxon Brittany or Ireland during this time. Now, in theory, any offended party could challenge anyone else to a Holm game during this time, regardless of social status. This could be a commoner challenging a higher-up noble of the time, and this could be triggered by by, say, a slight to someone's honor or over, a matter of property ownership, but even crimes that you wanted justice for if you knew someone wronged you in some way. Now, there are a couple of different interpretations on how the holmgang was performed, and this really comes from the fact that the practice continued for a good few hundred years. It was outlawed in, say, Iceland in the year 1000, but there are records of the holmgang being practiced all the way into the 1200s. So the most basic way to define the holmgang is that once a challenge was made or to resolve a dispute, a duel needed to take place, a date was set and a location. Some people say holmgangs were performed on an island where the two combatants rowed out to an island and that's where the fight took place. Some say that there was a set, fighting area, sometimes actually on, say, some type of hide, and the combatants couldn't leave the hide. Sometimes a border was made for the duel by laying spears on the ground. The thing that we need to understand is that the specifics of how the holmgang was performed change from location to location. I mean, another popular idea about the holmgang is that instead of actually trying to kill your opponent, you were trying to break the opponent's shield, and they would only have 3 shields each, and the first one to lose all 3 shields lost the actual duel. Well, that wasn't a universal practice, and it was kind of hard to find specifics that, okay, in Norway, this is how it was done specifically. In Sweden, the holmgang rules were this. In Iceland, it was like this. So unfortunately, I can't share that with you, only that things changed and there's no specific universal holmgang standard. Just like in many things with this period, nothing was really standardized, there were just local practices. And those practices changed over time. Another interesting fact about the holmgang is that it wasn't always to the death. Sometimes it was, but sometimes it was just until, say, first blood. And in certain instances, the loser, even though they were, not going to be executed, they could live, they lost everything they owned to the victor. So that's a significant thing as well. There are some claims, and this is kind of going back to what I was saying before, that there were actual professional duelists that abused the holmgang to basically commit legalized robbery, to steal people's property and stuff. But in Iceland, they actually did make rules to mitigate this by trying to outlaw duels to the death. They simply fought until a victor was established, and when not fighting over property specifically, the local authority, whatever it is, if it was a lord or the town kind of authority, would reward the victor with a measure of silver. An interesting thing, again, hard to find how prevalent this practice was, but if someone challenged someone else to a holmgang, okay, and didn't arrive on the set date, well, that had some pretty significant repercussions. They basically became an outlaw for abusing the law and showing no honor, and usually the penalty for being an outlaw was execution. I couldn't find any instances of a later practice that arose with judicial duels in the more high Middle Ages, and that is of a champion, where someone was unfit to fight in the duel. They could call on someone, or someone could actually volunteer to fight on their behalf. So if you know of any instances of that being allowed in the holmgang, share them below, but there are recorded instances of this happening later into the medieval period. So there are recorded instances of the holmgang being outlawed. What's interesting about this is that the idea of a trial by combat, this judicial duel, re-arises in other parts of the world, and were they disconnected, or were they people just re-adopting a tradition they knew about from a little way ago, or it was just a natural thing that evolved during this time? It's hard to say specifically what happened, but say in the year 1000, we see a trial by combat appearing officially, written and represented in the law in, say, the Holy Roman Empire. This is medieval Germany. But Otto the Great, in the year 967, actually sanctioned this practice in Germanic law. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 depicts judicial duels, and in 1216 the Pope himself asked the Teutonic Order to stop imposing judicial duels on their newly joined members. So there are plenty of accounts of this practice being conducted in medieval Germany, and a bit more regulation in how it's practiced, unlike, say, the holmgang, where the two combatants who met each other could actually decide on the conditions and rules of their duel just between themselves, okay? Even if there was tradition on how it should be done, if the two specific combatants during the holmgang type of duel wanted to change things and just fight the way they settled on, that would generally be how it's done. But when we go to medieval Germany, yeah, a bit more defined in how they were to be conducted. So there's a medieval German law book that actually prescribes certain things about a judicial duel, and it's really hard to pronounce. I'll read it, I'll do my best. Sachsenspiegel.
Sachsenspiegel.
Just like that. That's all there is to it.
Well, this book states that the combatants can be armed with sword and shield and wear either linen or leather clothing. Also really interesting, their hands and feet must be bare and they're not allowed to wear any type of head protection at all, and they can wear thin gloves, not like, armored kind of padded or whatever gloves, just thin gloves. So like I said, there's a lot of detail in regards to this specific judicial duel in medieval Germany. There's even a prescription to determine a winner if the accused does not appear after being summoned 3 times. And so they actually give whoever is being accused 3 chances to arrive at the duel and get in the fight, and if they don't arrive by the 3rd time, the accuser can perform 2 cuts in the air and a thrust, and it will be regarded as if he won the duel and the accuser lost. So depending on what crime was being claimed by the accuser against the accusee would also determine what penalty he would receive if he could be found, because he's obviously trying to lie low or just leg it out of the location. The thing is, even with how official these judicial duels were and how prominently they were practiced in medieval Germany, there were instances where there was an attempt to outlaw them completely. There is a legal code called, sorry for my German, I'll try and say it, the Kleines Kaiserrecht, I think?
Kleines Kaiserrecht.
Just like that. That's all there is to it.
It's a legal code that arises in 1300s that prohibits judicial duels completely, basically claiming that too many innocent men were dying as the result, which is interesting because that does kind of contradict this idea of faith. And so perhaps that's actually a misconception, that everyone thought that God would always allow the victor to win, when we're actually seeing attempts to end the practice completely because they openly acknowledge, well, too many innocent people dying, okay? People who just aren't as good as fighting, getting killed by other people. Well, in instances where an opponent was outmatched, okay, say when we come to how this judicial duels were practiced in Brittany, champions were allowed, but we'll get to there, okay? The thing is, even with this attempt to outlaw judicial duels in 1300, they were still practiced well into the 14th century and even 15th century. There's actually a prominent fight book written by Hans Talhofer, which prescribes certain ways in which judicial duels were to be conducted. And that dates to the year 1459, 15th century, okay? So they're still being practiced quite prominently. And interesting things just to share some of the ways in which Talhofer prescribes duels to be conducted. According to Talhofer, there were 7 offences that were grievous enough to justify a judicial duel, a duel to the death, okay? And this is actually interesting because now we even jump to a higher level of specificity, listing specific things that justify judicial duels, and I'll share them with you. Remember, this does not apply to the whole medieval period or every location in medieval Europe, all right? First of all, if these crimes had no witnesses, okay, a judicial duel would be warranted if there was an accusation of these crimes specifically with no witnesses and there was no real way to resolve it. That's the first stipulation. It was murder, treason, heresy, desertion of one's lord, imprisonment. This isn't official imprisonment like someone being thrown in prison, but like abduction, okay, kidnapping, if you take someone and imprison them unlawfully. And then perjury, fraud, and rape, okay? Those are the offences considered grievous enough without witnesses to justify a judicial duel, a fight to the death, trial by combat. So I tell you what, that's an interesting thing to adapt into a fantasy, actually having the specific crimes, okay, that determine, all right, time to fight it out. Another thing Talhofer actually shows is situations where if an opponent is significantly disadvantaged against another, and the example he gives, if it's a husband fighting his wife, so something's clearly gone wrong in that marriage when they fight to the death, okay? But the disadvantaged opponent would be like placed in a hole up to his waist. And of course that would be the husband, because in reality, most men have a massive advantage physically over most women. Not in every situation, but most. And I know if I love my wife, this would never happen, but just hypothetically, if some crazy thing happened where I ended up in a judicial duel against my wife, I've been able to compare the strength differences between me and my wife, and it's amazing me. It's really surprised me, the strength differences. And my wife isn't considered particularly weak for a woman, and I'm not considered particularly strong for a guy. I'm kind of just average. But the difference between us physically is staggering. And so if there was ever a fight between us, I'm not even sure being put in a hole would make it an even fight. But it would do something, and Talhofer seemed to believe that was a fair way to conduct it. So there we go. So let's jump over to merry old England, because trial by combats were of course practiced in England as well. And look, unfortunately I can't cover every single practice in all parts of medieval Europe, such as in France, Italy, and actually there are some instances in France I will be able to mention, but this was a common practice, and I'm just sharing some specific bits of information I was able to find. For instance, the trial by combat in England was actually called the wager of battle, and it appears to have been introduced into England after the Norman invasion. William the Conqueror, all that good stuff, which kind of makes sense because if we go back to the Holmgang, this was a judicial duel practiced in Scandinavia, classic Viking kind of culture, and of course, who do the Normans hail from? Vikings. And so the practice seems to have remained amongst them, and then when the Normans conquered England, guess what they brought with them? Though when it was practiced in England, it wasn't called the Holmgang, it was called the wager of battle, as I mentioned. And it remained in place all the way through the High and Late Middle Ages. And interestingly, the last recorded instance of the wager of battle, the trial by combat in England, was in 1446, where the servant accused his master, his lord, right, of treason. And so there was a fight between the servant and the lord. The lord drunk too much the night before, or before the battle, and he was a bit sloshed during the fight, and he lost, and the servant killed his lord in the battle. So then, it's very interesting when you look at the actual specific recorded instances of these duels, and servant challenging lords. Also, this type of duel was practiced in Scotland and Ireland into the 16th century as well. There's an interesting kind of variant on the judicial duel in England, where when guilt was established basically without a doubt, if the defendant was caught in the act of, say, murder, actually several people caught him murdering someone, okay, and there was no doubt that this crime was committed. If he, say, attempted to escape from prison after being arrested, okay, they took the attempted escape as kind of evidence, well, that clearly means you're guilty, or just very strong evidence to the crime, regardless of what it was. The defendant could not claim to say, if they're found guilty, they say, I am innocent and I want to prove it, and so I claim, a trial by combat, okay? That was denied to them when the evidence was so strongly against them, and they were not allowed to try and fight for their innocence officially in a duel, and they were just executed. What's really interesting about this example, generally as we've been speaking about judicial duels, even in my own mindset, has always been about the person accusing someone of a crime. You did this, I can't prove it, so I will be pushed out, I'll fight you, all right? But this actually shows that a judicial duel could be used by the defendant to try and circumvent a negative outcome. If it looks like things are turning against them in the duel, say either they are innocent, or even if they're not innocent and they know that there's no witnesses, right, that they can't be proven that they actually committed the crime, they can try and get out of it and say, well, if I'm gonna die anyway, no, I'm innocent, I will fight. I'll fight for my innocence. I demand to prove my innocence through a trial by combat. So if we look at this from, say, a legal kind of perspective, it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing. It's bad in the sense that a truly guilty person might find a way to not only circumvent justice and get away with the crime, but kill the person that they wronged in the first place. So that's horrible and terrible. But if the person is actually innocent and they're going to be found guilty, well, they're going to die anyway. They have a chance to try and fight for their life. Now, that's probably pretty horrible as well. Still, in this instance, when there's overwhelming evidence for the person's guilt, they can't claim that. They can't get a fight to try and get out of it. And I just find it really intriguing that this is a common practice that arose in the medieval period because it was so hard to find true justice, to actually establish who really did what. It's very, very interesting. Now, this is where we come to an interesting circumstance where someone could fight on behalf of someone else. We have recorded instances of this happening in the wager of battle in England. And the specific instances were in the cases where the person who was being kind of caught into this fight, basically being challenged, right? If they are a woman over 60 years of age, it was basically determined it's unfair to force her to actually fight. If it was a child under the ages of 7, which is kind of horrifying that a child could be in such a situation where they're challenged to a judicial duel, or to try and prove their innocence, they have to call for a duel. If they're lame or blind, clearly not going to do well fighting. In these situations, the case could be determined by a jury, something we're far more familiar with, or a champion could be found to fight on behalf of these people who are not properly capable of fighting for themselves. Here's another really interesting situation about judicial duels in England, and it's the situations where it was a trial between an individual and, say, the state. There was not an actual individual who was wronged. Say if something was stolen from the crown, or in matters of treason and other things like that, and the defendant, wants to try and gain their innocence through a trial by combat. Who are they actually going to fight if there's no specific individual to fight them? Also, what if the accusers were a group of people, and there was more than just one defendant? Do they all fight? Well, no, Only one would be chosen to fight amongst the group of people being on trial, essentially. And so, in this case, the individual who's chosen to fight out of the group, and in the cases where it's, say, the state authority, the crown or whatever, needed someone to fight in the duel for them, they would actually call someone from prison into the duel to fight. And these individuals who are kind of representing each side were called the approver. Now, it's an interesting title. Obviously, it had different meaning in the medieval period, but the approver were the ones who would fight in the duel. And so, again, this was from a group of accused people to represent the whole group. And in the case where it's the crown versus someone, it was a prisoner. Now, if the prisoner, this is interesting, if the prisoner called from prison to fight in the judicial duel won 4 duels in a row for the crown, they could actually gain their freedom. In some instances, they could gain their freedom. In other instances, they were still hanged. But in the instances where they could gain their freedom if they won these duels, well, that would give a heck of a lot of incentive for them to fight to their best ability. But having said that, they might just not want to die anyway, and that's pretty good incentive to try and fight. So, some really interesting stuff here. In most instances of the wager of battle, they were basically all to the death. They would fight until either someone died or someone collapsed from exhaustion. It was until last man standing. And so a small cut, or even someone, obviously defeated, lying down with a sword pointing at them, that wasn't enough, It needed to be to the death, or if someone completely collapsed and exhausted and the winner was easily determined, well, the loser would probably just be executed anyway. And so this is the instances where nearly all duels ended in death, or death of one of the opponents. Now, having said that, there are exemptions, For instance, if the duel lasted from sunrise until sunset, like a full waking day, the accuser, the one trying to defend himself, would go free, So that's against, there are so many specific instances, and they're different between cultures and areas and stuff like that. It's all fascinating, and if you like to learn about this just for the history of it, or if you want to adapt it into a fantasy setting, these are great things to try and grab from and adapt into your, book story, whatever. These are all brilliant. And so, if you fought from sunrise to sunset, in some cases, that would prove your innocence. And imagine fighting all day, There are other instances where they might not end in death. For instance, if the accuser, if someone is actually challenging someone because they want justice, you either raped my wife or you murdered my son or something like that, and you demand to think, you can't prove it, you don't have witnesses, but you know this person did it, or you think really strongly this person did it, all right? You challenge them to a duel to get justice, and you're fighting and you're losing, and you know you're going to die if it continues. You can call out that you're vanquished by saying craven. That was the word. If you called out craven, and that meant I am vanquished, You're accepting defeat. That means you would not die. The guy should stop. But it also meant that your freemanship was revoked from you. You are no longer a freeman. What does that mean? Well, there are certain privileges associated with freemanship. Some people even had a writ of freemanship and stuff like that. And so if you were not a freeman, the privileges of freemanship were revoked. And what were they? Let's save that for a whole nother video, shall we? Because the whole idea of serfdom and freemanship and everything is very misunderstood. And again, things are different between different areas. And so it's a complex subject, just like every subject really about the medieval period. And on top of the privileges of freemanship being revoked, he was liable to pay damages to the person he was accusing. What would those damages be? to be determined by whoever is officiating over the situation. So basically, after analysing judicial duels in detail from 3 main locations, Scandinavia, medieval Germany, and England, there are other examples, of course, being in France and stuff, in Italy, Spain, and all these things, like they're all around. Looking at them all, there are 3 cases which could, say, trigger a judicial duel. One, from an accuser. You did something wrong, I don't have any evidence to prove it. If I tried to take it to trial, the authority couldn't say yay or nay on the matter, but I demand justice, I demand satisfaction, I know this happened, and you need to be punished, so I will punish myself. We're gonna fight. I challenge you to a duel. That was the first one. Then there was the case of the innocent being accused, no way to prove their innocence. I know I'm innocent, I didn't do this, and if I'm gonna get executed anyway, I demand a trial by combat so I at least have a chance to survive, okay? That was the second one. The third is when these 2 people are arguing, neither one wants to go to a duel, okay? And they're accusing one person of one thing and one person is defending and no one's calling for a duel, but whoever is officiating over this dispute can't reach a conclusion. They could call for a duel to determine who is right and who is wrong. And then the people in this dispute have no choice about it. They have to fight. Now, the instances where the authority is demanding a duel, look, I don't know, you have to fight it out, and if you don't, well, the matter can't be settled, basically. And if you want any result out of this, no, you don't have a choice, you're gonna fight. There's a specific account of that happening in France, and it seems to have happened in many other areas, but did it happen in all areas? No, remember, we have to understand it's a fluid thing, okay? Nothing ever was perfectly standardized, but in specific locations, in specific times of the medieval period, we do see some level of standardization that just wasn't carried over to other areas and other times as well. But my goodness, this is a fascinating subject, okay? And this is the information that I can share with you at this time. Judicial duels, they were real. They were a big thing in the medieval period, and they were practiced in many specific different ways. So I really hope you've enjoyed. I certainly have. This is a fascinating subject. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again. So until that time, farewell.
Bam! Just like that. That's all there is to it.